just yesterday, some of you saw me post some really delicate hairline flourishing. There's a new pigment that Kurotaki are making, a sort of updated formula. So I thought I would just see how it works. Okay, that's manageable. All right, so clean this off. So as you know, we have obviously the copperplate catch-up classes which are finishing up. So today we're looking at numbers, punctuation, and diacritical marks, and I'm also going to throw in some non-Latin based letters. So if you do Cyrillic or Greek and you need help with your copperplate script, I would suggest you join the class this evening, see how they're done. So today I just thought I would, as I'm working on the handout for the Flourishing Workshop, I just thought I would show you guys some of what I'm working on and some of what you'll see in the workshop next Sunday, and give you a sense of how this workshop is going to progress. I've had so many people ask me about this Flourishing Workshop because my idea for flourishing is very different. I started my geometric and my fourfold symmetry, and from my fourfold symmetry, I built this sort of overarching geometric construct which allows you to really understand how a flourish works and why the flourishes work the way they work. So I'm going to run you through some of the concepts. So let me swap the phone around and get started. So here are some of the basic concepts. Just give me a second. Sorry, just need to set this up properly. So here are some of the basic concepts that I use when I am teaching. So when I'm teaching flourishing, I use these simplified concepts of approaching the structure of the flourishes. So, the thing about teaching is, the geometry that structures the flourishing is really all about geometry, basic geometric shapes. So when you see a flourish, you see this. When I see that, what I see is this. And immediately you can start to see how the flourish is structured using this geometric principle that I've been working on. So of course, you can't start off like that. So if you're not going to start off like that, then you need to start with some geometry. So you have to be able to do this. Mark off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's your geometry. Once you can build this kind of simplistic geometry, you can structure the flourish a little bit more easily. So we started here. Obviously, you'll have to be able to start here. So notice I'm starting in 4 different places because this is, I keep telling people flourishing is not magic. You really have to work at it. You really have to understand what you're doing. And then once you've done this, you then have to figure out how to do it again. So it's the same size, but we've just halved the amount of dynamic turns we have in the flourish. And, I sort of looked at a lot of physics and terminology in physics to try and figure out how these things work and what they call them so that, I wasn't having to invent new terminology. Or I wasn't having to, as I like to say, reinvent the wheel. So once you get to that, you can then figure out that this So for those of you just joining us, I'm just looking at how flourishes work, how my concept of geometry works for flourishing, because we have this flourishing workshop next week, Sunday, and we have a lecture on Tuesday. So I've done a ton of research putting together a history of flourishing. So once we have this, you go 1 and touch, and 2 and touch, and 3 and touch. So if you wanted to overlap, it's only really a matter of tightening up the space, this space, so that the shapes start to overlap. And immediately the flourish starts to structure itself. It starts to make itself a little bit, it starts to make itself a little easier to construct. So of course, from here, you can produce, so instead of going under, I'm going to stop here. It's the same shape. I call this the line of universal beauty loop, because this is the basis for flourishing. So in copperplate script, we have a line of universal beauty, which is the basis for the majuscules. And we have the swell stroke, which is the basis for the minuscules. And I thought, if the majuscules have a stroke and the minuscules have a stroke, then the basis for the flourishing stroke cannot be the same thing. It has to be something else. So I came up with this stroke called the line of universal beauty, because it's the same shape, loop. Now, most people think, as did I foolishly thought that this was the basis of a flourish. This is how we learn to flourish. Because most of us would have done, you just buy a broad edge nib, and the first thing you do is you create a decorative pattern. So I started to think that we all think that this is the basis of flourishing, and that's wrong. Because in order to get this to work properly, what you do is you do this, and you go up and over, and back and down. So that's when I realized that this is the basic shape, because that then gives us. And for those of you who've studied with me before, or who are studying with me on our Zoom classes, you know that I'm very conscious of the fact that there are 2 aspects to the line. So we generally teach you, well, most teachers teach you this, that the letter has 2 parts. And I always tell my students that somebody might tell you that the letter has 2 parts, but in truth and in fact, this letter, what you're seeing is the mark. You're not seeing the trace and the mark. So when I teach, I always teach with the trace first. Up. Here's the mark. Here's the mark. Here's the trace. Here's the mark, and the mark, and the mark, and the mark, and the trace, and the trace, and the mark. So a letter, a line has two parts to it. It has a trace in the air and a mark on the page. Now, as soon as you start seeing that, you start to see that a flourish is very much based on this trace and mark pattern. So we very easily go from here to mark, trace, mark, trace, mark. And if you do it this way, you always end up with a much more beautiful pattern because it's rhythmic. It's all about breathing. So when it comes to the flourishing of text, let's say we have an area to flourish. You want to flourish half what's it called? Half an ellipse. So you really start to see how the English writing masters produced the 18th century flourishes, because they really understood what they were doing, and it's this is what we're going to cover in the workshop. So some of the really beautiful flourishes that I've come across in my research. I love this flourish. I think this is such a beautiful flourish. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And I was doing this, and I thought, oh, so lovely, this flourish. And then I thought, hang on a second, this flourish is essentially an A upside down. But look, it's also an ampersand. And this is a couple of years ago. This really just stunned me when I started seeing that. Even the letters we do, right? So if you do this, right, that can very easily turn into this. I was like, oh my gosh, look. So even the letters that we write are essentially flourishes, right? If obviously if you just sort of expand them. And then there's some lovely, beautiful shapes in the medieval, in the English roundhand period. So I've just repeated the flourish, and it's sort of a mirrored here, and rotated and flipped over there. So it's the same flourish, but you're looking at this and going, wow, look at that. But what you're not looking at is the mirror repeat, because once it's inverted, you start thinking it's something else. So there's a ton of possibility when it comes to flourishing, and trying to understand what the flourish is and where it comes from and what it's telling us is really important. There are absolutely masses of different kinds of flourishes. So let's look at a simple flourish, right? We can do, so I've shown you this. And I've shown you this. It's the same pattern. So instead of doing this, which is what a lot of people tend to do, and come down, why not try this? And come over. Look, these four things are essentially the same pattern. Then from this, you can build this. You can build this. So it's just it's just sort of taking your time with the flourish and what the flourish is and how it's constructed. And then, of course, once you start really looking at the geometry, it starts to show you where the balance is. So we have this, and it is divided at the third mark. And if we divide that third mark again, that's where the internal spin is. And then if we divide it this way, we have a series of quarter marks. So we've done a third, we have a third, a third, a third. We're halving the middle third, so that's now halved down to the middle third. The lines are still parallel, and so that's how the flourish starts to hold itself together. And this is sort of, this is really, really basic, super basic flourish theory. Then, of course, once you get to that point, things really start heating up, right? So they turn into some really crazy shapes. I'm going to do some of the more excessive shapes for you because I've just been sitting there going through these shapes, building the handout for next weekend. These are lovely. These are really, really lovely. Okay, let's see if I can do this off the top of my head. Right, let me think this through. So we need to work in. So what I do when I'm teaching, when I'm flourishing, is I sort of talk myself through it. Okay, so I'm just talking myself through. I'll talk aloud, right? So okay, I always say we, even though it's just me in the studio. So I always say, right, what we need to do is we need a series of spirals with enough internal space to add other lines so they are parallel. And let's add a little curl at the top here. And from here, we've gone in. So let's rotate out and come back out and out again and rotate around itself. And come back out. That there. And let's take an internal curve and a curve and another parallel curve. Let's add a little bit of decoration here that is in line with this. And let's add a little diamond drop there just to make it give a little bit of depth. And let's take a half and a curl and a straight bar and a half, and let us curl out from here. So this is how I talk when I'm flourishing in the studio. And let's add a little acanthus leaf curl. This could come out this way, and this can follow along to here. Let's add another leaf curl, like so. How exciting. So I know this is a really, really complex flourish that I've just thrown at you. But, you know, you start to see that it's not as difficult as you think it is. Now, if we look at some, let's zoom out a little bit. If we look at some 18th century flourishing that we find at the end of words, on top of words, what we see are things like this. So that's a little bit too round, so let's make it flatter. Much nicer. So do you see how I'm sort of, this is a very different type of flourish. So I'm having to change the way I was flourishing with this. So this is much smoother, whereas this is a little bit more staccato. Too circular. So do you see how slow this is? It's very, very soft, very gentle. And so I'm working with even ellipses. I don't call these ovals because I find once you start calling things ovals, you're thinking of an egg. And if you're thinking of an egg, it becomes really lopsided. And look, this is a flourish, right? But I've just turned it into a bee. So, you know, it's really interesting once you start sort of looking at the structure of the flourish, and you start really paying attention to it and taking your time with it. It builds itself. You know, it tells you where to go. It tells you where to stop. So the structure of the flourish is really based around momentum. Right. Let's see if this will work. Is it gone? not even sure if you could see that. You're just starting to see those hairlines. So this is this new pigment that I'm trying test driving for Kurtaki. So it's a brand new pigment they have, which they haven't released as yet. So that's, and this was done yesterday, but look how bright it settles in. It's really great once it's settled in. All right, so let's grab the phone and see what. Have a look at that. Again, straight on top. Yeah, I mean it's it's so delicate. This hairlines are so fine with that gold. All right, let's see some of the questions. Right, let's see. How to manage the proportion of the curves to look beautiful. So this is where my geometry is second to none. It beats any other application, hands down, any other learning process. Because once you start ruling up the lines naturally halve themselves. So remember, my fourfold symmetry is based around angular confinement first. Once you can make straight lines which are perpendicular to each other, it doesn't matter if they're a square or if they're a rectangle. If you're making a rectangle, the compression of the height to width, the height to length ratio will tell you what kind of ellipse you're going to fit in there. Once you can see the straight lines, you can work out how to divide up that plane-sided figure, which is either square or rectangle. Once you start dividing up the plane-sided figure, you'll find that the shapes become much more regular. They become easier to see. I know lots of people teach with ellipse. Well, they call them ovals. They teach with ovals. The problem with ovals is, how do you know where the division is on the curve? And that's quite difficult to figure out if you're not accustomed to using both rhythm and whole arm movement and muscular movement. So it can be quite problematic. Can you take the Flourishing class without taking the Catchup classes? Yeah, of course. You know, the Flourishing is a very, very different class to the Catchup classes. We are considering doing some Flourishing Catchup classes because, you know, this covering. So the masterclass next weekend is only really an introduction to my technique, my geometric technique, so that it helps you to understand what you're doing wrong, where you're going wrong, and more importantly, how to correct it. Because, you know, sometimes you do a flourish and you look at it and you're just like, oh, that's terrible. But you don't know why it's terrible. Something's wrong. And it's not even, it's not even the shaking. The problem isn't the shaking. I mean, you could solve the shaking. The problem isn't the shaking. The problem is, how is the flourish balanced? And if you don't know what to look for in the structure of the balance, that becomes really problematic. It becomes really unsettling because you're looking at it, you're seeing, we have a sense when something's right. You can sense that something's not quite right with it, but you don't know what it is. So the introduction that we're teaching next Sunday will teach you how to look for these little issues so that once you start to see how they work, you can then start to correct them much more easily. We are thinking of expanding it into, a sort of full-blown course because, you really want to sort of, use the structure of the geometry to then expand out into things like copperplate script, into Spencerian script, into modern calligraphy. It's the same sort of principles for the flourishes in modern calligraphy as it is in copperplate script, in Spencerian, in English roundhand. You can even use this structure to go back further into cancelleresca, into italic. And then once you start looking at the flourishes in fraktur, then the fraktur flourishes, there are so many categories of types of flourishes used in fraktur that, it's really quite fascinating. I mean, this is why the lecture on Tuesday is going to be so amazing. I think those of you attending the lecture on Tuesday are going to be so surprised, because I've done this really wonderful paleographical approach to what a flourish is, when do we see them evolving, how do we see them starting to evolve. It's really, really quite exciting. So Gingy's put up the link for the flourishes there. We'll do a post and put it up in the we'll do a story and we'll put that up as well. Thanks, Sarah. This is the first time I'm talking today, so my voice is a little bit rough. So it's basically like having squares or rectangles as the imaginary pattern, and then we fill them with the curves. Okay, so there's a little correction there. I wouldn't say fill them with the curves. So I use this principle of angular confinement, and it's more like you are confining the curves to this angular construct. So it stops them from becoming wild, and it stops them from flying off the handle, because you're working within this construct. Now, being able to make the grid is one thing, but it requires breathing, because at no point am I holding my breath. So, you're sort of breathing and you're going and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, 6, 7, 8. Then you're going and. And so the breath is what controls the amount of structure to the flourishing. What is your approach to pictorial flourishing? Which pictorial flourishing, Julio? So if you are, I'm not sure which form of pictorial flourishing you're talking about. Are you referring to the pictorial flourishes that you see in the Renaissance period, where you have men with shields and spears all flourished up? Even that, think if you think about the structure, it's all bound within the outline of the shape. And once you bind it within the outline of the shape, the next thing to work out is, where are the angles? And when I start looking at pictorial flourishing, Renaissance pictorial flourishing, I look at this and I try to work out what's the bounding shape and how can that shape could be turned into a series of geometric shapes. It's like when you're just learning to draw. They never give you an apple and say good luck. They teach you to draw a sphere. You learn to draw boxes, and then you learn to draw two-dimensional shapes, then three-dimensional shapes. You learn some shading. But it's really this angular confinement that really helps it to work and really helps it to sit together. So I hope that sort of excited some of you. That I know some of you are already coming to the workshop on Sunday next week. And I know some of you are really excited about the lecture on Tuesday. And I was saying to Tim a couple of nights ago, I've never heard anybody give a lecture on flourishing, talking about the history of it and where it's from and how it sits within paleography. So I'm really, really excited. I'm really excited about how it sits and how it works. So that's really quite fascinating. How we, having this paleographical context for the flourishes. So what is this question? What led to the making of the Universal Penman book? Okay, so that was just a book for Bickham put together this book to show off to people, what penmen could do. It has varied flourishing. Okay, so I guess I've answered your question. I don't really know what you're trying to get at. So the book was made as a sort of virtuoso book to show off the penmen and what they did and how amazing their craft was. All right, so we have a class this evening on numbers and diacritical marks. And I'm also, like I said at the beginning of the talk today, of the live, I'm going to look at non-Latin letters as well, because on Sunday is our last copperplate catch-up class, where we're going to look at the writing of text. So, it's one thing to teach you letters, but how do you actually put that together to create something? So we'll look at that on Sunday, and then that's it for the copperplate catch-up classes. The lecture on Tuesday is on Flourishing, and then the workshop on Sunday is on Flourishing. All right, so I'll see you guys soon. Have a nice evening, and those of you coming to the catch-up class later, I will see you later.